Hello my moons! Today I'm going to be recording a video on how I like to paint silky fur, and specifically silky white fur in this case. I am using my friend Laura's dog. His name is Baku and he is my model for this piece. He is a silken windhound, so he had the perfect type of fur to use as reference for this piece. I'm starting out here just painting in a background using Prussian blue, and I got that crazy background texture using the technique in my How to Paint Watercolor Textures video that I did a couple months ago, which I'll link in the description. And I'm just kind of doing that to add some contrast around him. You'll notice that this entire piece has a fairly minimalistic color scheme. All I'm using is my shadow shade mixture, which consists of burgundy yellow ochre, carbazole violet, Prussian blue, and all of those are by Daniel Smith, by the way, and you can find them in the description as well as the other mediums. White fur tends to be fairly reflective, just like pretty much all fur and all hair because it's kind of a shiny surface, but I find that white fur especially picks up the colors around it. And so you'll notice as I continue painting this guy, I work a lot of that Prussian blue coloration into his shadows, as well as a little bit of Aztec gold, which is what I also use some of in this piece. So starting out on him, I'm just going to be filling in some of the muscles with a little bit of my shadow shade mixture, which I actually mixed with a little bit of extra Prussian blue to give it more of a bluish tone. And I'm just kind of outlining the muscles that I've already sketched in pencil and laying down some very basic shapes and color blocking. A lot of the work will be done by creating strokes of individual hair strands, but I also every now and then will use this slightly larger brush to kind of block things in and soften the hair as I go along. One thing to take note of when you're painting any kind of furry creature is the way that the muscles show beneath the fur. You'll notice in the case of this guy that you can see his muscle definition quite well, and some of that is because he's kind of propped himself up on his left arm there, so it's really exaggerating those biceps and triceps. But even still, he has somewhat long hair for a dog, and he is a fairly sleek breed of dog, and while he does do sports and works out, you might be surprised to notice quite so much muscle showing up under the fur. I've noticed that many times when people paint animals, and this was something I did a lot in the beginning when I was still a little bit less familiar with anatomy, I would just kind of paint a coat of fuzzy texture along the animal's body and maybe paint in a few very basic hints at the underlying structure, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to the specific muscles. However, since fur grows directly out of the skin and muscles sit just beneath the skin, you actually end up having quite a few directional shifts in the way that the fur moves, and you can usually see, if you look closely, you can see the muscles much more than you would think. So that's something to keep in mind when you're painting fur over the top of the creatures, is how it moves over muscles. We'll talk a lot more about that as this video goes on. So starting out on the face here, the face of most animals tends to have a little bit shorter hair than the rest of the body. On dogs, this is usually especially noticeable, especially as you get closer to the area right around their nose, and then of course around the eyes and inside of the ears. And there are some exceptions. Terrier breeds tend to have those long mustachy faces, but overall you'll sometimes see a little bit less hair around the face and the muzzle. And in the case of this guy, you can also see a little bit of his skin color through the fur on the muzzle area, so you'll see a little bit of pink, and actually some of the darker colors on his muzzle are most likely his skin showing through as well. So that's something to take note of when you're painting fur on animals, is where the fur tends to be thicker and where it tends to be more thin. adding little details like that can bring so much life to your characters. This guy has various dark colored spots on his body. His ears tend to be a little bit of a darker color, and then he's got that marking on his face, and he's got another one on his back and side area as well. So for that, I'm just using my shadow shade mixture, and I'm painting it on using a 012 or 12-0, I never remember which way it's written, brush, so a very small point brush. And I'm just kind of dry brushing those lines in. I've talked about this a lot, but when you do fine detail with watercolor, it's important to not have your brush too wet. Mine is usually just barely damp. If you're working on a watercolor ground prepped surface or a cold pressed paper, then you're going to have to possibly get your brush a teeny bit more wet than you would need to on a smoother surface, and that's because a little more wetness helps it get down into the cracks and textures of your surface. Otherwise, it ends up just kind of skipping over the top. So you kind of have to find that special water balance for each surface that you work on. And as I'm painting this, I'm just paying attention to my reference and the directions in which I see the hair going. I'm not going for photorealism, and in most of my art, I may do the fur even more unrealistic than this, but I definitely like to base my foundations in realism because I think the way that hair moves naturally is just beyond perfect, and though I may try to exaggerate it or change it up a little artistically, the foundations definitely help me feel like I can give more life to my characters. And this face is really fun because we are dealing with several different lengths of hair, from the super short fur on the end of the muzzle to the longer hair on the cheeks and around the ears, which is something you'll see a little bit to sometimes a much less level on other breeds of dogs, but that's something you'll see on most dogs. And actually on a lot of other mammals too, when I think about it. So even though this is a dog with very slick, silky, beautiful hair, and he's super well brushed and maintained and healthy, there are going to be certain areas where the hair has different textures due to what's in it. So you might have noticed on yourself if you've ever gone a few days without showering, or if you do like me and you maybe only actually cleanse your hair with any kind of shampoo or cleanser once a week. As the week goes on, the natural oils in the hair build up and the hair begins to kind of stick together and clumps a little bit more. That sounds kind of disgusting, but it's a very natural thing that animal hair does and human hair. And animals are more adapt to not bathing, and people who only wash their hair once in a while, the oils tend to adjust themselves so that they aren't as prolific. However, you're still going to get some of those natural oils, which is going to make the hair kind of chunk and stick together. And when you see that on animals, it's going to create a little bit more of a feathery texture. You're going to see a little bit more clumping in the fur. And so even though this guy is super well maintained, like I said, you might see a little bit more of that chunking and feathering in areas around the ears where there's going to be naturally maybe a little bit more oil or wax present, which can get into the fur. Not to mention that the fur is going in a million different directions as it folds over the anatomy of the ear. So you're going to get things that look a little bit more chaotic and sticking out on his ears than you would on, say, his neck, which, as you'll see in a little bit, is a lot more smooth and flat compared to the chaotic nature of the fur around his ears. Coming around his little snoot here, I'm just continuing to brush on some color, And for this area, I'm not doing quite as much of the dry brush etching. I'm actually using a little bit more wet paint and kind of putting down small washes of color. And that's because he's not a very big painting. And so in order to portray the more smooth texture of the hair, I'm really just putting down washes, and that's how I'm going to differentiate between those dry brushed little kind of etched in sections versus the more smooth sections. You can kind of show different textures of hair by how long and how prominent you make the lines that you paint. And of course, I couldn't resist giving him a unicorn horn because I just felt like he needed a horn. And I realized that Laura, when she's drawn this type of dog before, has also given them unicorn horns. So maybe I was subconsciously channeling a little bit of her energy when I did that. And for the horn, I just used some of my Aztec gold pigment to kind of brush over the top, and then I end up going in and refining it later. I just kind of blocked it in for the moment. I actually spent a fairly long time on the face because it's such a beautiful, expressive part of the dog. So I was going around and continuing with layering up and etching in those little fuzzy details. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it very well in this sped up video, but the brush I am using is actually fairly dull at the end, that 12-0 brush, but because of that, it's kind of gotten all fuzzed out at the end, and if I press it down flat against a surface, I'm able to make the end kind of fork out and develop these little separated prongs, if that makes sense. And those work very agreeably for painting kind of dry brush fine hair details because it naturally spreads out and allows me to paint several lines next to each other. So even though I go in with a really fine 20-0 brush that's very sharp now and then on this piece, I actually prefer using this slightly more dull brush for doing fur detail and blocking things in like this. Painting fur definitely consists of a lot of layering and building up, and especially when I'm painting white fur, I like to build up a little bit more slowly than I might on a different color of fur, because white fur tends to, at least for me, and I've heard this from others, be a little bit more difficult to paint than most colors, given its light, soft color and its reflective property. It can just be a little bit challenging, I find, to maintain the integrity of the white fur and the white color while still keeping a sense of value and texture. So in order to do that, I tend to paint it sometimes a little bit more slowly than I would other colors. It's funny because I paint white fur quite frequently, but it always ends up feeling like the most challenging of all the colors I paint. My favorite color of fur to paint, and the fur I also find to be the least challenging and just the most fun, is definitely black fur. I love painting black fur. You'll notice I paint a lot of black animals, and it's just such a joy every time. White fur, it's much less fun, but I just love the look of it, and it's always a great challenge artistically to work on it. So now we've moved on to getting into this neck area, which has that beautiful soft wave that just kind of falls down and goes toward the center of his chest. And in the original photo, he was wearing a collar, so that kind of distorted the directions that the hair was being pushed into, and I kind of kept those directions unrealistically, even though I didn't paint the collar in. So his neck isn't, of course, going in 100% accurate directions because I copied the position the fur would have been in if he had still had the collar to some extent, but I just liked it. So the area on the shoulders is one that I've always found to be particularly interesting and particularly challenging. And here's a little close-up of what those different lines look like on the shoulder. You can really see the way I use short and long lines to show the different ways in which the hair changes and turns as it goes over the muscles and bones of his arm. Oftentimes, when an animal contorts itself in any way, whether it be lying down or moving a limb or curling up, you're going to get a lot of directional changes in the hair, and that's going to make some hair stick straight out toward the viewer, other hair might be laying flat, some hair might be going in the opposite direction that its friends are going in. And paying really close attention to what causes the fur to move in those different directions can help you bring a ton of personality to your characters. And even if you're not painting an animal, this is really useful if you're painting somebody, like a person wearing something furry, because even on like a furry coat or something, the fur is going to change direction depending on how the coat is folded or laying on the body that's wearing it. This is something I notice on this big faux fur coat that I wear every winter. The way the hair changes and shifts as I move my arms around is kind of similar to how it would on an animal if an animal was wearing it. But the shoulder, neck, and chest area is one of those that I notice on a lot of animals has some of the most fascinating directional change. And I think that's because the necks of a lot of canines tend to have longer fur than a lot of the rest of the body. So the neck and about halfway down the back, they kind of have this lovely mane that falls over their withers and goes into these kind of different directions. Withers are the shoulders. Sorry, I don't even know if they call them withers on a dog or if that's just on horses. But yeah, it falls a little bit longer over the shoulders, and you might get a little bit of those long tufts of hair right between the area that the collarbone would be on a person. Dogs actually don't have collarbones because they don't need them since they're kind of forward moving creatures. Not all animals have collarbones, isn't that weird? But yeah, on dogs you'll often get kind of a tuft of hair right in that area, a longer tuft of hair. And then the hair starts to shorten as it goes down the rest of the body. So it'll kind of shorten as it gets toward the arms and towards the lower back. And then it'll sometimes lengthen out again on parts of the lower kind of thorax area. So along the center of the rib cage, sometimes you can get some slightly longer tufts of hair. Although, not in the case of this particular breed of dog I learned. They have such a deep chest that it actually rubs on the floor a little bit when they lay down, and it tends to be completely bald, apparently, which I would imagine must be the case for a lot of animals with a really big, deep chest, which is something, if you know my art, that I like to exaggerate on creatures, even if it's not a creature that would normally have that big, deep rib cage. It's kind of a thing I like to exaggerate, and so that's something to keep in mind if you want to be realistic. An animal with a furry animal it is, with a really deep rib cage might not have a lot of hair at the center of their rib cage because it may rub off as they're laying on the ground. But you don't have to go that realistic. I tend to want to draw long fur along the rib cage, whether or not it's really big or not. So here you'll notice that I sometimes shift into using that slightly bigger brush. I don't know what this brush is. It's a synthetic sable brush by Black Swan, but I don't remember exactly the size. But it's very dull at the tip, and I like using it for stuff like this because it's kind of rough at the end. It works well for blocking in small features like this. And I'm also able to use it to soften areas that I've already kind of dry brushed in. So what I mean by that is when you paint hairs one after another, they can kind of tend to look a little bit stiff and artificial sometimes, and they don't really have that silkiness that soft hair would have. They look a little bit more wiry, and since we're not painting an Irish Wolfhound, we're painting a Silken Windhound, we don't really want that wiry texture. So I'll use this brush now and then with just a little tiny bit of clean water so that it's just a little bit damp, and I'll kind of scrub it lightly over the lines that I laid down. Not enough to lift them back up, but enough to just kind of blur and soften them. And that helps keep this little dog looking softer and silkier. And you'll notice too that I paint somewhat chaotically, so I don't necessarily do all of these steps one after another. I kind of switch back and forth between using really fine brushes to lay down those dry brushed hairs and then going and using a larger brush to blur them out. And one of the reasons I do this isn't just because I have a chaotic nature, but it's also so that I can see if my ideas are coming across and if things are working the way that I intend them to. So sometimes I'll get the urge to kind of finish up one specific area or try something in a specific area to make sure it's reading the way I want it to, rather than finishing all the steps at once only to discover that they didn't work out and I have to go back and change everything, if that makes sense. I have tried to be a step-by-step person that fills out every step concisely, one at a time, but it just doesn't seem to work as well for me, so doing it a little bit more chaotic like this seems to be the best way that I know. Coming down to the foot area here, and of course one of the things I love about these breeds of dogs is that they have these really long feet with really long toes, and I find that to be so beautiful. My dog has, I'd say, pretty average feet. I think her feet are really cute. They're fairly delicate, but they're not necessarily super long like that. She's a Belgian Malinois, so I'd say they're kind of average and slightly on the long, delicate side. And then my other dog, the one that some of you may remember I picked up off the highway on the way back from Arizona last year, who now lives with my mother, she has these fat little marshmallow toes, and she is a good old desert dog. She's an Australian cattle dog, Dutch Shepherd mix, we think, with maybe some kind of terrier mixed in there. And so she's got these kind of shorter, thicker little feet. And I think that probably has to do with her purpose in life and what she's built for. She's built for maybe herding on rough terrain, her ancestors are, whereas these dogs, I believe, are sight hounds, and they're meant to kind of chase after creatures, so everything about them is very long and lanky and not so boxy like my other dog, who has the kind of fat little marshmallow feet. That doesn't have a whole lot to do with fur, but it's just kind of a funny observation I was thinking about when thinking about the differences between dogs, because they are such vastly different shapes. So these dogs have another really interesting quality about their feet, which you don't get to see too much in this piece, but it is a fun character trait you could incorporate into creatures of your own. They have really long hair between their paw pads, so they kind of have these Dr. Seuss feet, I like to call them, because the hair kind of trails out, and a lot of people will trim the hair, but if you see one with untrimmed feet, they will have all this wild hair kind of sticking out, and it's really cute. I've seen that on certain types of cats too, like my Maine Coon cat that I used to have, he had kind of furry Dr. Seuss feet like that as well. But because you don't get to see those long tufts of hair too much, except a teeny bit on that right front paw, I pretty much just used washes, simple washes over the feet in order to portray the slightly shorter hair that they have. If I was painting this as a really, really major piece for myself, I would probably put tons and tons of loving time into rendering those feet out, but that wasn't so much my intention here as to just show the differences between using a little bit more simple washes to render short, super short hair like you would find on the feet, and using longer washes to render out the long hair on the body. And now we're pretty much at the end, and I'm just kind of texturing in that background and adding the final touches. So what I did for the finale was just to go back in, deepen some of the values and shadows on his body, and smooth out and blur out some of that hair. There are a couple of instances where you'll see the really fine white hairs sticking out on his body. Those were all done with either white gouache for the super fine hairs, or a little bit of white watercolor ground for the thicker sections. I like to use those things to highlight my whites rather than just leaving areas clean, because when I work on watercolor ground prepped surfaces, it tends to be pretty easy to smudge the paint, and I tend to get my white areas a little bit dirty and they don't retain that super pure white look, so I'll often go back in and highlight a little bit with watercolor ground in the areas that I need to be really stark white. And even though this guy is white, he actually doesn't have a lot of pure white present on him in this piece, because I did paint him kind of in shadow a little bit, kind of in lighter shadows. He's laying out in the shade, I think. You'll see I took this long 13mm flat brush at the end there, and that's what I used to do kind of the final blurry touches on him. I just felt like his hair was still looking a little teeny bit too stiff and wiry, so using that flat brush with barely any water in it very carefully was a way to really blur some of those details out and make him feel a little bit softer. And I'm just brushing some gold pigment over the tops of the textures in the background to make it a little bit more interesting, since it is just an abstract background. And I wanted to gift this piece to my friend, because not only was she kind enough to allow me to reference her beautiful dog, but she's an inspiring fellow artist, and she's also been wonderful help in helping me find a trainer for my real life dog. So I wanted to give her a little gift with this piece, since I knew I would be working on it. I hope this was helpful for all of you, And thank you so much, as always. If you have anything you want to see more of, let me know. If you have other kinds of fur you want to see me do walkthroughs on, please let me know. And I will see you again really soon. Have a beautiful day or night wherever you are, and be well. Bye!